Welcome to the Movies That Made Me. I am your host, Luke Sorba, and the theme this episode is movies that made me want to change the world. Movies that in some way have influenced us. Perhaps we ran from the cinema and immediately took action, or perhaps it just stirred some thoughts that we are still processing all these years later. My father was someone who joined the Italian partisans at the age of 17 to fight the Nazis, and my mother was a feminist who got through an open university degree in politics and sociology. And my brother spent his spare time selling an anarchist magazine. So I was probably already cursed, doomed, destined to be someone that wanted to change things given that family background. But movies also played a role with me. Whether raising consciousness or calling to action, I can remember as a child wanting to change the school system. After seeing The Blackboard Jungle with Glenn Ford, Spare the Rod with Max Bygraves. Yes, that Max Bygraves. It was a film against corporal punishment made in the 1950s. And Lindsay Anderson's If. As a teenager who spent many evenings and afternoons at the National Film Theatre, All Quiet on the Western Front, Jean Renoir's La Grande Illusion and Kubrick's Paths of Glory made me furious how battles between national ruling classes overwhelmingly sacrifice the working classes. James Dean in Rebel Without a Cause made me want not to repeat the mistakes of my parents, and now my children wish to escape from mine. Sergei Eisenstein's Strike, Paul Robeson in Proud Valley, and Sally Field in Norma Ray fueled my continuing loyalty to the trade union movement as a progressive force. Well, The Front, also directed by Martin Ritt, and Henry Fonda in 12 Angry Men convinced me that minority views need to be heard rather than silenced. Ralph Nelson's Soldier Blue opened my eyes to the genocide of Native Americans by European settlers, and also that too many Westerns had been lying to me. Norman Jewison's In the Heat of the Night with the late, great Sidney Poitier, and Horace Ove's Pressure put racism in the US and UK at the front of one's mind. John Schlesinger's Sunday Bloody Sunday and Midnight Cowboy showed that if one does not have freedom over one's own body, can freedom exist at all? Marlene Goris's A Question of Silence provided a furious riposte to misogyny. Marco Ferreri took on consumerism in La Grande Abbuffata. Fassbinder's Fear Eats the Soul foregrounded the plight of the migrant worker. Ken Loach's TV play Cathy Come Home, that of homelessness, and Truffaut's Les 400 Coups of disaffected youth. Any Movie by Louis Buñuel and Federico Fellini warned us about the vices of the church, as did Vittorio De Sica's and Satyajit Ray's on the injustice of poverty. Jean-Luc Godard took on capitalism, Lena Wertmüller, fascism, and Silkwood and Erin Brockovich had a working class woman taking on an industrial giant, poisoning people for profit. While Claude Faraldo offered us an anti-hero against pretty much every aspect of modern society, the eponymous mute, priapic and anarchist cannibal Themrock, starring the late Michel Piccoli. And when I spoke to a class of 20-year-old drama students and asked them, they called out the titles Free Willy, Avatar and The Imitation Game. Films which, if you think about it, cite concerns around animal welfare, environmental destruction and trans rights. And those films are without mentioning the four fantastic films chosen by my two equally fantastic guests, which encourage them to leave the cinema and remake the world. Well, let's find out if it did or it did not. Those guests are architect, former theatre board member, but it still means a lot to him, political campaigner and psychotherapist Anshu Srivastava, plus novelist, director, performer, LGBTQ plus activist, and a fellow psychotherapist, Stella Duffy. Welcome both, and thank you not only for being here, but for sitting very quietly through my very long introduction.
We were so polite.
You were, because you must have wanted to join in at many stages or to stop me, one or the other, or a bit of both.
Bit of both,
Well,
Luke.
it's over to you now. So that's my canter through films that I remember from about the age of 14 onwards, when I started to immerse myself in cinema. And I noticed that two of the films you've chosen are about adolescents, and they are about adolescent boys. And when I was listing those films, I was remembering my adolescent boyhood. However, this part and the rest of the show isn't about me, it's about the two of you. And Anshu, I will ask you to mention the first choice of the two movies that you're bringing to us to talk about. Before you tell us a bit more about the film, I would like you, if you don't mind, to tell us a little bit more about what you were doing and what sort of person you were when you saw this film for the first time.
Well, when we were asked to think of films that made us want to change the world, it had to be something from when I was 17 years old, because that was very important to me at the time. And so both the films I chose were from my teens. The first one I saw in 1981. So I was in my first year of my A-levels. I was living in Salford in Manchester. My family had uh, immigrated to Manchester in the late 60s from India, and I was growing up in entirely white environment. Of the 2,000 children that were at my secondary school, I was the only one that wasn't white. And so you can imagine that had quite a profound impact. I was looking, I suppose, really for something to identify with, because I was such a outsider.
Mm.
And the first film, which is Gregory's Girl, made by Bill Forsyth, may seem like a strange choice, given it's a very small scale and sweet kind of romance about teenage children in Glasgow. But it was a film that I could entirely identify with. It felt like it was the first time I was seeing other children, a school, an environment, a playground, a street, a park that looked like the ones that I was growing up in. And the fact that it was set in Glasgow in, I think, Cumberland, uh, an entirely white neighborhood, working class neighborhood, um, absolutely chimed with my own experience. It felt like the next day I was going to school was the same type of corridors and teachers and gyms that were part of my life.
So you've described the landscape
Mm.
of the movie, as you say, chiming with your own. Within the movie, how Gregory, this sort of awkward, self-conscious teenager who's trying but not necessarily achieving in his football career, and trying, but we don't know whether he's going to achieve in his romantic career. Are there resonances between how he relates to the kids around him and where at the stage he is in his life and what's important to him, that relate to you within those two contexts that are similar?
Well, like him, I was like desperate to try and get my first snog, and I was desperate to see if somebody might invite me to the chip shop for a bag of chips. What was really sweet, and I think really appealed to me, was that he and his friends were all there was no there was nothing malicious in the film. That's what I really liked. And so many other kind of teenage films that we were watching around that time that were coming from across, the pond, like Porky's and Kentucky Fried Movie, and always had this kind of mean streak in them.
Mm-hmm.
And I really liked Gregory's Girl because it didn't have that, and the characters were complex as well because they were looking forward to a life, and that really, meant something to me actually. And I think that's why it was so important, because not only could I see myself in that environment, there was something very hopeful about it.
Stella, do you remember the film?
Yeah, I do. Sorry, Anshu, but as a teenage girl, I found it sexist. And as a grown woman rewatching it last week, I found it even more sexist. Even though it was made in 1981, even with 1981 sexism, I get it's fully male-centered. It's about the male characters. There's no genuine perspective from either of the two girls, really. But what I found most depressing was the casual sexism of it. Watching it now, but I know I found it shocking at the time that it was getting such a positive reception. And I could see why all the young men loved it. But as a young woman, I mean, in 1981, I was 18. It was like, what is Bill Forsyth doing getting that close-up on Dee Hepburn's bum? I was a young feminist. I knew that was already wrong, and packaged in something that is sweet and nice. I actually think there's something really insidious about the casual sexism in that film, and it disturbs me even more looking at it from now. On the other hand, I think the last 15 minutes is absolutely gorgeous, and I think the whole point of the film is the last 15 minutes. And any British man I know, or any man raised in Britain, because I think there's not necessarily the same thing, but anyway, all the men I know raised in Britain say, oh, Claire Grogan. That's who they're excited about when they think about this film. That's who they remember. And she's only in those last 15 minutes. And the film, for me, really took off at the point where there's a girl who matters as much as a boy. I mean, I don't expect anything other than heteronormativity from these films, but yeah, I'm sorry. I wanted to, because I remembered finding a bit of it sweet, and actually it was only that last bit that I found sweet. And luckily, my annoyance of it had disappeared over the years. It just came back last week.
Well, I only saw it again last week after many, many years, and I can't fault you for your description of it. Actually, I think it's absolutely spot on. It surprised me because I hadn't seen it for a long time. How, as you say, casual and all in from start to finish, in a sense, it's it has these uncritical, straightforward readiness to to take up these sexist positions. So I don't want to say a but because there are
Say it.
I won't say but because I think that stands on its own. But we didn't have a lot of choice back then.
I know.
So as I say, for me it was if it was a choice between Porky's, which was not casual, it was aggressive sexism, and this kind of sexism, which was less aggressive. That was the choice that I had.
Yeah.
So within that context, this was more something that I could actually identify with. But nonetheless, yes, to everything you said.
I was actually thinking about it when I was watching it last week. I was thinking, Saturday Night Fever was out in 1978. Right, so it's only 3 years earlier, and it's not dissimilar in age. Yes, they've all left school, but they're not dissimilar in age. And actually, of course, I mean, Saturday Night Fever is also, imbued with sexism, but it's pointed out. We get to see John Travolta's character's misogyny. There's the whole stuff around pregnancy and how dramatic it is, and how sexist the attitudes around it. I agree with you with all the other American films you're citing, but I do think there were some films in the States that did have an awareness around some of these things. Luke, you'll know, when was The Outsiders? When was that?
That was about 1985.
See, I knew you would know. About 1985.
Yeah,
which has some. I mean, I think John Gordon Sinclair and Gregory's Girl is absolutely delicious. He's everything that you want in an anti-hero who's awkward and uncomfortable. I just think that, unfortunately, he's that in a deeply sexist film that was deeply sexist at the time.
One thing I would say to contrast the two movies you've mentioned is that, because I'm a big fan of Saturday Night Fever and I saw it when it came out, is that Gregory has not yet lost his innocence, but Tony Manero definitely has.
True.
And so I think one has to look at those films as a kind of almost like a before and after, being introduced to the real world of boys and girls, and men and women, and the straight world. Yes, that's a given within those two films. Nevertheless, Danny Boyle managed to carve out something that still holds up with our more progressive modern values. When he put on the 2012 London Olympic sort of opening show, he used a clip of Dee Hepburn playing football in that. So what he took out was the fact that within that film, it showed that girls could play football as well as boys. In fact, Dee Hepburn's character, Dorothy, is the best footballer in the school. So it's just interesting how when he looked at the source material, he did manage to find something that perhaps stands up to the contemporary view, whereas the rest of the film is as you've described it.
Well, I think another important part of the context was going to the comprehensive school and the community I grew up in. We weren't watching films other than the films that were on TV. Going to the cinema was few and far between. And so, I mean, it was interesting, hearing Luke about your, kind of gallop through all these important films. It was much later that I came to those films. So there was something that was pointing me towards those films in Gregory's Girl. The kind of way that the adults were portrayed in this rather they were more childish and infantile and stupid than the children. There were things within Gregory's Girl that gave me an idea that there was more than the kind of even the casual sexism, or the racism, the sexism, and the classism that I was growing up in. Because even though it didn't kind of skewer those things, and even though it wasn't angry about those things, it was at least beginning to point them out with working class actors. It was at least beginning to think about a family where, for example, it's interesting that the mother doesn't appear in the film. Now, one might see that as being, a kind of further erasure of a female character. One might also see it as being rather, a non-normative setup. Because the mother isn't then also stereotyped as a figure within the family system. The way that it was maybe the first time I'd even come across the idea of food that wasn't English or Indian food, with the character of the friend who's making all this like fancy continental food. I had not heard of any of that food, so it was kind of beginning to pique my interest that was even possible, that there was other types of food. The idea, even though it was again very, very limited, and can be certainly seen today as problematic, that the kind of the leering from the teachers was actually something that was at one hand kind of condoned, but at the other it was actually quite close to an experience that we were actually also dealing with. We were asking questions about our teachers, what was actually going on between adults and children, for example. So it was at least touching on subjects that I hadn't really come across before, not in film, and not certainly in a film where I could see myself or the people around me in that film. And it was often very funny as well. So, yeah, I think from the perspective of looking at it, as we are today, I agree with everything that has been said, but it was still quite radical for me when I was 17.
So we'll move on from Gregory's Girl, but we'll stay in the world of adolescence. When you were talking about contrast with American teenagers, I was thinking of all the John Hughes films, and much as I really enjoyed them, they are sort of unnaturally good-looking suburban middle-class characters.
Oh, come on. Molly Ringwald in Pretty in Pink is intentionally working class. She's American working class. Come on.
Yeah, and and she also has a very interesting relationship with the her single parent, lone parent, who was her father, which does sort of set it out differently. But the actors, many of whom went on to become what were they called, the Brat Pack,
Yeah,
are drawn from a different sort of cast. And I say
they're lovely, good-looking, nice white middle-class American kids. Absolutely, yeah.
Then the boys and girls in that film. I'm interested in these sort of transatlantic, sort of contrasts. The Outsiders, on the other hand, is a film that you mentioned earlier, which deliberately looks at people who live either side of the tracks. But it has to do it in a stylized way to get away with it, which is it's also filmed in a retro way and it's in black and white.
There's definitely more pimples in Gregory's Girl than any of those other films that you've mentioned.
Yeah, you don't get way more pimples than Demi Moore crying on the floor going, I never believed I'd be so tired at 21.
And those American actors are so buff. I was never buff as a teenager.
Surely you were, Luke. Surely you were.
I wasn't. I am now. Oh boy.
Well buff.
Wasn't then. So I'm going to move on to another movie that captures the experiences, and it's through the eyes of an adolescent boy. Stella, I hadn't seen this film. I've been meaning to, and as a result of you mentioning it, I've now had the pleasure of seeing it. So thank you.
Very good. So, shall I talk about it?
Yes,
is this the point? Okay, so this is Taika Waititi's Boy, and to be quite honest, it's not a film that made me want to change the world. What it is it's a film set at a time and place where I was all about changing the world and where I believed that the world desperately needed to be changed. So for me, seeing it in 2010 when it came out, it was like, yes, this is the thing. So it's set
in 1984. Is that what you're saying?
It's set in Aotearoa, New Zealand in 1984. It's set in the East Coast, which is even now still a very largely Māori populated place. And Anshu, my family emigrated somewhere in the late 60s from South London Council Estate to a small timber town in the middle of Aotearoa, New Zealand's North Island, where I was a white minority, albeit a colonised nation, but the people that I grew up with were largely Māori, Samoan, Fijian, Niuean. There were other white immigrants, Scottish, French, German, but my town was 70% Māori and Polynesian. And that has so rarely been shown on film as a kind of standard ordinary. Like my experience of growing up white, Pākehā, which is Māori for the white person, with Māori neighbours was like normal. It wasn't exoticized. They weren't the other because we were all at school together. And I'd never seen anything that did this culture, people who I have, grown up alongside working class Aotearoa New Zealand in the same way as I saw in this film. Once Were Warriors does, but it's very urban. Whereas there's also something just gorgeous about Boy, because yes, it's about growing up and yes, it's about change. But in New Zealand at the time, major political changes had happened. In 1981, the Springboks journeyed to New Zealand during a not worldwide boycott of South Africa by any means, but a pretty intense time. And for the first time in Aotearoa New Zealand's history, there was an absolute determination to make voices known that were against the racism of South Africa, and to use that to also point out the racism of the colonized nation in which we were living. So there was a hikoi, which is a march from a colonized piece of land all the way down to Wellington that coincided with stuff that was going on around the Springbok tour. And these 3 years were when I moved from my tiny timber town, where I'm the youngest of 7 kids and the first in my family to finish high school, let alone the first in my family to go to university. I moved to go to university, and the year I moved to go to university was 1981. So I left this working class small town and went to university where it was all politics. For the next 3 to 4 years, it was just all politics. And so what I love about Boy is it is set in a time in New Zealand when everything's changing. And so you've got very traditional Māori tanga, Māori culture, which is represented by the grandmother who leaves at the beginning of the film. And then you've got the father character, who's played by Taika Waititi, who comes in and out of this child's life in terms of fantasy, but also in reality. And of course, the fantasy dad is nothing like the actual dad. And then you've got these kids who are just kind of living their life with hardly any adults around. They're just kind of getting on with it. And it's kind of precious in not dissimilar to Gregory's Girl, in this hopeful, maybe, where are we, edge of adolescence place. But what I just think is so phenomenal about it is there's one Pākehā character in it, one white person. And it's just like, we can do films like this, right? This is why I think it's so groundbreaking. So for me, emotionally, it's set at a time that really matters to me and a place that really matters. But politically, in terms of making films like this is a film about people of colour who have been colonised for coming up for 250 years, made by one of those people of colour, and it's got one white person in it. I mean, that's a groundbreaking film just in that place. And the white guy's nice. He's just a bit dorky and a bit dumb because he's a teacher. That's where I am with that film. It moved me immensely, and I saw it. It was on, I think it was at the Barbican, and Waititi was talking about it. And it was just really cool to hear him speak about it and how important it was for him to show that time as well.
Anshu, did you manage to catch up with this movie?
Oh, well, I saw The Wizard of Oz in preparation for today, but
which frankly is another film that did change my life, and I wanted to have that, but Luke wouldn't let me have it. That's why you saw that. Apparently Pippa Evans already had The Wizard of Oz, but I have to tell you why The Wizard of Oz changed my life, and I really need you to keep this in because this is gold. People say that The Wizard of Oz is about Dorothy saying, "There's no place like home," and they go, "Oh, that's because home's really lovely. That's because home's really gorgeous." She's not. She's saying there's no place like home because we can never go back. We cannot go back to what home was before we left it. And that actually joins up brilliantly with Boy, because that was my home that I left. And of course, time's passed, so I can't go home to that either.
I mean, what is interesting is that, both the films remind us of the home we grew up in. And also the film that you chose only has the one white character, and that was very important to you in that film, given the context and the history of the country and how the film was made. And the film that I chose didn't have any black characters in it at all, but I could put myself into that film, even though it was. It wasn't obvious to me at the time what that allowed for me, but to be allowed to feel that there was a space was ironic, actually, and I think part of the kind of coping strategy as well for dealing with that kind of situation. It's interesting to hear how it liberated something for you.
But see, I think there's something about what you're saying there, Anshu, that is about how when we are already other or othered by the mainstream, we have to dream ourselves in anyway. So you had to dream yourself in to Gregory's Girl in whatever ways you could. So you can grab onto this is what adolescence feels like, or this is what working classness feels like, or this is what outsiderness feels like. From my perspective, it's always been looking in from the outside going, can I see some queerness in there that I could dream into? Because I'm always having to dream it into things, even now, obviously. Or for both of us around class, can we see ourselves in that? Similarly, I didn't have loads of movies in my childhood. We had one cinema in Tokoroa and 2 TV channels, and the TV finished at 10 o'clock at night, and the movies were on Saturday nights only. in the building around the back of the library. And, so it certainly wasn't tons of Pasolini, that's for sure. But dreaming, and hard though it is, because I think it takes extra work on our part, particularly when we're young, to have to dream ourselves in. But I also think as adults, it's really useful when we've done that, because it helps us as a writer, it's helped me understand telling other people's stories. It helps us be able to find our way in to other people's stories in a different way. So, which I don't recommend necessarily finding oneself on the outside all the time as a child and an adolescent, but I do think it can be useful.
One particular aspect of the film that I found interesting was the credit sequence, the end of the movie, in which you have this mashup of Michael Jackson's Thriller, because Boy is obsessed with Michael Jackson, as many children of that age were around the globe, because he was such a global, had such a global reach, and the traditional Haka, and the two are kind of fused in. What did you think about that, Still? I thought it was wonderful.
I absolutely loved it. Not only do I love that, but you've also got girls doing the haka, and traditionally, in old school, girls didn't always, depends on the iwi, the tribe. But what's so cool about it is that it's that bit where you go, and you know what, Luke, when I watched it again, I thought, I'm so glad Luke will be seeing this, because he does love a bit of credits, right? And that there's this astonishing extra gift in the credit sequence. And it works, right? It really works brilliantly. And it's not a pastiche of Thriller. It uses Thriller. It uses elements of Thriller. If it does anything, it pastiches bits of the film that we've just watched. But it allows the haka to also have its place. And you've got all the young women and the girl characters doing poi, which is just, it's really cool. It's a really lovely element.
I mean, apart from it being dramatically and visually just really exhilarating, when I thought about it afterwards, I also thought it was a very, very interesting thought piece when we talk about dual heritage and cultural appropriation and so on. Let's stay where we are now, which is with Anshu and the Battle of Algiers.
So when I was in my sixth form college in Salford, identifying with Gregory and the rest of these Glaswegian teenagers in this very white environment with all of its sexism and classism, inside was raging the Battle of Algiers. Inside, I was raging. And I didn't have a film to connect with at the time, but I had the feeling. A year later, I came down to London to study architecture, and we were given a list of films to go and watch. First time anybody had ever given me a list of films to go and watch, and one of them was Battle of Algiers. And I remember 18 years old going to Scala Cinema in King's Cross, watching this film with some friends. I mean, it's so powerful and raw and distressing. The violence is straight on, and the cruelty is straight on, and it was how I was feeling inside whilst trying to dream myself into Gregory's Girl. And it is the story, well, the recreated story of the liberation movement in Algeria in the 50s, fighting against French occupation. The French have been there 130 years. And the film was made, I think, in 1966 by the Italian filmmaker Gillo Pontecorvo. Although I'm saying this in front of Luke, so I'm sure he's going to have to tell me how to say it properly. Interesting that it was made by an Italian, because the Italians were busy with their own pogroms at the time in other parts of Africa. It was also interesting because whilst the Algerians, were from North Africa, they looked like me, and the films that, for example, Luke was mentioning earlier with Sidney Poitier and others, I'd seen those, and they were very important to me. And actually, the civil rights movement and the films that came out of America in that period were like super important to me. But this was the first time I had seen a political film with people that looked like me, and it was really, really kind of a turning point, I think. And I was angry. I was flipping angry. Are we allowed to swear on this podcast?
Yes.
I was fucking angry.
Fucking angry.
I was absolutely raging.
Yeah.
And that film really, it is so direct, right from the first, from the off. There's an execution in the first 5 minutes, which, even though I saw it again this week, I watched it again for probably the first time in 40 years. I could barely watch it. So, yes, I know that there's much to say about how it was made and the kind of style of it and the kind of the technique of it. But it was an outpouring of feeling for me. That's what it was.
The reason Ponte Cordova made it was he was approached, and I don't know why he was chosen. He was approached by one of the FLN officers who'd lived through the conflict. So I presume he had some pedigree in political cinema or documentary making, because even though it's a feature, at times it feels like a documentary. And with the almost completely non-professional cast, that was also, I think, one of the winning qualities that contributed to the overall experience. Of course, it got banned in France, inevitably. I was thinking, Anshu, revisiting the film, which of course is extraordinary, that in this country, the Troubles in Ireland there isn't a film. There isn't one. I was thinking Michael Collins, The Wind That Shook the Barley, Hidden Agenda. There hasn't been... No filmmaker in the UK has taken on what the makers of the Battle of Algiers took on. I think in revisiting a recent period so graphically and so comprehensively, and from several points of view as well.
Yeah, I was thinking about Northern Ireland from like after the shocking opening. I was like, oh yes, this is that film. But I too have never seen it about Northern Ireland. I haven't seen the Branagh Belfast one, but I'm guessing it's not.
No.
I hadn't seen the battle. I'm struggling with words for this. I found it brutal and amazing, and I mean, you're right, Andrew. It starts with an execution, but the execution is so French. It's a guillotining. And I saw this last week, and I was like, and I had to stop the film, and in shock that it was happening and it was still a thing. And I don't know how I didn't know that, or how I didn't think that maybe they did, and they thought it was okay. That I'm not saying other countries weren't killing people barbarically as well. Of course they were, but there is something about it being a guillotining that felt particularly horrendous. It's the head removed. Anyway. But I just thought this was so layered, and actually for something made so relatively close to the event. You've got that amazing speech from the colonel saying, well, we were the resistance. We're not the bad guys. It's even where it's saying the French colonizers are the bad guys, these French colonizers who are being the army for the bad guys ostensibly, they get to say, yeah, but we were the resistance 10 years ago. 20 years ago. They get to put their case, which I think is really rare in a film like this. Normally you'll get one side or the other. And yes, it is absolutely much more from the independent side, which is the voice that needs to be heard. But to see the complexity of it, I think is amazing. And the fact that, yes, guerrilla warfare will kill innocent people. It will kill some teenage kids just dancing in a milk bar. It's not always, the good guys kill all the bad guys and only the bad guys. And that was so, I thought, phenomenal. There's, I knew Camus' writing about it, and I know that there's still, this huge discordance still with the people who are like, well, yeah, Camus is Algerian, but he's Pied Noir. He's Algerian who identifies as French. Camus moves to Paris and he's immediately singled out as black and he doesn't fit, so there's that. And Camus writing about, well, yes, great, let's have a revolution, but let's not have an Islamic revolution. As an existentialist, he doesn't want a faith-led revolution. He wants a revolution of the people. And that led to a whole bunch of 1960s, anger. And what I think is really interesting around this is it sort of touches on it being a faith-led revolution, but it doesn't really go into the full extent of what that might eventually mean in terms of how other Islamic revolutions have, and just considering Afghanistan at the moment, right?
It's interesting watching that again now, since the War on Terror and since Edward Said's writing, because there's almost a casual moment of passing over the way that the FLN first go to the Casbah, and in order to actually create some sense of not only power but also fear within the Casbah in terms of their authority, that there's this very conservative approach, which is violence to in a sense, rid the Casbah of these degenerate, or in inverted commas, elements.
Exactly. They attack sex workers, they attack people who drink, they attack pimps. And what's so cool about that is they show that the FLN is complex too. That's why I think it's amazing. It's not just going, these are the good people who are oppressed, these are the bad people who are oppressors. There's so much more layered to it. And I don't think, even now when people are trying to make films about colonization, they're not doing it. That whole piece of North Africa, you go back to the Roman invasions, when it was Berber territory, that land has constantly been invaded. It became Muslim because it was invaded. It's been layer upon layer of people invading. And what this is some people going, you know what, we're going to name it for ours. And in doing so, we are going to rid ourselves of these people who have been our oppressors. And it's that barbarism of the oppressed as well. And it's phenomenal for that. But the thing about them not being professional actors, they're so good.
And what's also incredible is in the complexity, the French paratrooper, the colonel, he says very clearly when he's asked about torture, well, this is what you get if you want to have occupation. There's a very clear-eyed position. I mean, it's brutal, but it's not in any sense hypocritical.
Yeah, he's not saying we didn't torture, right? No. He's being completely honest, and he's doing that in front of the general, which I think is and on camera. There's something really,
I think that's possibly amazing. Why it was banned in France more than for any other reason, because of that honesty.
Yeah,
and we won't find a British movie with a British officer saying that.
No,
around
absolutely.
Ireland. The guillotine. So, very interesting. The two of you mentioned that image because, of course, in France, it's very much, it's a signifier of their how they see their narrative, their transition from the ancien regime to this secular, Enlightenment, democratic. This is a self-image the French have through their revolution.
Yeah,
and it has this ambivalent. For me, as a viewer, this ambivalent signification, even when it's abstracted from actually what's going on around it. Our fourth film of the quartet, Stella.
This is Donna Deitcher's Desert Hearts from 1985. And so in 1985, I was 22. I'd been coming out slowly, both to myself and to people I loved and cared about since I was about, 15. And I was properly out by then. But I was desperately looking for anything that showed me. This goes back to, can we see ourselves on screen? Can we see ourselves on screen? No, not if you're a gay woman, not if you're lesbian. At that time, we had The Killing of Sister George. That was it. Mm-hmm. In which women are really horrible to each other, lesbians are ghastly, and being gay is only going to be sad and awful. That was it. I mean, seriously, one of the reasons it was so difficult to come out was because I had no idea what I was coming out into. I had no words for it. I had no understanding of what it might be. But what was so exciting for me about this film was that, yes, it's set, in the, I think, 60s when Jane Rule wrote the Desert of the Heart book. But it has a happy ending. And I don't mind that that's a spoiler, because I want to encourage people to see films in which queer love has a happy ending. And the way it made me want to change the world was to allow that queer love can be happy. That being outside doesn't have to always be only painful. This makes me want to cry even saying it, actually. Because so much of queer life is presented as it's so outside we can never have joy. Mm. It's so outside the world will never let us find out each other, be free, be together. And in this deeply groundbreaking film, these two women do. There's the, in inverted commas, uptight, city, educated, extremely middle-class professor who comes to Reno to get her divorce, and Helen Shaver, who is beautiful in a cool, blonde, American kind of way, very Tippi Hedren, who meets the delicious Patricia Charbonneau, who pretty much, Luke knows my wife, set the template for all women I must fancy ever. Just gorgeous, delicious, but also funny and a bit gawky and a bit, don't tell Shelley I said that, and a bit, just sort of out of her depth. And there's a class thing going on, because there's a working class, less educated woman and a very posh woman. There's a where are we from? There's the country meets city, but there's falling in love. It's that it's possible to fall in love, and to allow us to show that on screen, to show... Oh, and also to show lesbian sex like it's not just, ooh, they cuddled and then they came. Because that is pretty much what lesbian sex, unless it's in porn for heteronormative porn, in which case it needs a man who's a plumber. That's what lesbian sex had always been shown as. And there it is, there's lesbian sex where they do more than cuddling. So all in all, it's a great film, but it's also got loads of fantastic supporting characters. And it made me think it might be possible to make art that I could write, that I could create, that also showed my truths, which I think is pretty big.
Anshu, you saw it recently. I remember when I first saw it in the cinema, but had you only seen it recently, Anshu?
I didn't know about the film.
Right.
Until Stella introduced me to it, and I'm so thankful you did. I think it was as radical as Battle of Algiers, because it is so direct, but in an entirely different way. Yeah. It's not trying to say anything other than what the characters are living.
Yeah.
And it's also very complex. All the characters, as you say, are given a certain complexity, and nobody's there just being instrumentalized or used as kind of a way to make the plot work. But just coming back to the two leads, it's a love affair which is, really has had me really turned on.
Yeah.
It really had me turned on from start to finish. The chemistry between the two is fantastic, and there's such a struggle for them both. The younger character, who's not the English professor, has all the best
Yeah.
lines.
Yeah, isn't
Yeah.
it? The working class,
Yeah.
not usually the ruler of the world girl, so has the best lines.
She always has
Totally.
the best lines,
Yeah.
and that it's kind of so like a first love as well.
Yeah.
Even though they're not by any stretch having their first relationship, either of them, there's something very, very poignant about that as well, that they're discovering something, each of them in a different way.
Absolutely.
And how excited they are about that, and
Yes.
frightened as well.
Yep. And how other people are frightened for them. So the I can't remember her character name, but played by Audra Lindley, kind of like a Barbara Stanwyck, Western character. She's amazing, the older woman. But so the thing about her character that I think is so interesting is she loves the Patricia Charbonneau character. She wants to care for her. She almost has a sexual desire for her that we're led to believe is sort of there, although she's hanging on to her dead husband. But when Patricia Charbonneau's character loves someone else, and the other person is another woman, then her internalized homophobia or her actual homophobia all comes to the fore. But it's also to do with her fear. Like you're talking about their fear about their relationship, but she's also got a fear. She's got a perfectly valid fear for this young woman who she cares for, that it is going to ruin her life, because that was a perfectly valid thing to think at the time and in many places now.
Well, I did wonder whether, in a sense, she recruited that fear to actually deal with her feelings of loss.
Oh, good point.
Because there hadn't really been a sense, or it wasn't actually plausible that she hadn't had a sense of her, this other woman who was kind of a daughter to her, but lived in the same house and was clearly having, relationships with other women.
Oh, I think she was fine as long as the relationships weren't going anywhere. Once it mattered, that's when she felt jealous.
That's right. But that was, I think, to do with the loss. And then that she, in a sense, recruits this kind of homophobic position in order to manage those feelings, because she can't simply say, "I'm afraid of losing you."
Yeah.
But it's available to her as a way of dealing with it, because it's available to us in society as a way of dealing with difference when we're actually trying to deal with more difficult feelings. So yes, it's an important moment as well in the film, because up to that point we haven't really seen a kind of the homophobia up to that point, and it doesn't come from where you imagine it to come from. Given that they're in Nevada, and it's kind of this, in inverted commas, Hicksville, you might imagine there's some kind of place is going to come. I'm thinking of that film,
Boys Don't Cry.
Boys Don't Cry.
Boys Don't Cry. And earlier in a previous episode, we talked about My Beautiful Laundrette, where the homophobia is very much incarnated. The homophobia and racism is incarnated in those those skinhead characters that are literally besieging the couple.
But when it comes from the usual suspects, it's easier to avoid, as it were. Emotionally, when it comes from the mother figure, it's and this other woman, as you say, it packs a punch, actually.
It does, and the obvious candidate is the good-looking young guy,
yeah,
who quite fancies, the older woman professor, and he just goes, she won out again. I lost her. That's the kind of attitude he gives it, and he would have been the really cliched and obvious and kind of typical, and that's been written many times. So yeah,
it's a beautiful film.
It is a beautiful
in both senses of the world. Of the world? Only the world was. Only the world was as beautiful as this film. But I mean, the outer and the inner beauty are in the movie. And here's a little interesting coda. Hollywood, particularly in the 80s, was trying to cram more and more sex into its product. However, this particular film, I think it was a Samuel Goldwyn company, they tried to cut most of the sex scene out of it. Yes,
Of course they did.
Of course they did. Whereas elsewhere, they are doing the opposite. I wonder why. Well, that's a rhetorical question. We don't need answers. I would like to mention Five Easy Pieces, directed in 1970 by Bob Raffleson and starring Jack Nicholson. He is a highly educated eldest son of an affluent family from the serene and green Pacific Northwest, all of whom in his family are virtuoso classical musicians. But we find him at the beginning of the film living in a working class Texas community where the dominant sounds are just industrial clanging on the oil field where he works as a driller. And the only music is Tammy Wynette. The key moment for me when I saw it as a teenager is the scene when he's back in his family home and he turns on a room full of smug and privileged bourgeoisie and shouts, "You are all full of shit." And at that time, I was a very radical socialist sixth former, but in a 400-year-old private school. Where I founded a kind of a think tank called the Utopian Society. And I took part in the school uniform revolt and I was almost expelled because I wore trainers to my A-level exams. So this Jack Nicholson character, Bobby, who's refusing to live the life society expects of him, was obviously going to resonate with me. But whereas at the time, I interpreted the ending when Bobby kind of leaves everything behind and hitches a ride to Alaska as kind of heroic. He's giving up his status because he wants to build something new and better. But when I rewatched it recently, I noticed that the character leaves behind his jacket and his wallet. And I now see him as choosing to go into oblivion. And I also felt bad about the kind of blameless people that he's hurt on the way, particularly his girlfriend, who is brilliantly played by Karen Black. She's a diner, and the diner waitress in a great scene. And he's hurting them because he is sort of chronically alienated. It is still a wonderful film, and I still think it's a defining piece of Americana of that period. And I also credit it as Jack Nicholson's finest screen performance. So I'm going to put that out there. The second film is... this is my favourite film by an American director this century. And it's called The Florida Project, directed by Sean Baker in 2017. And it's through the eyes of a little girl who lives in a very poor... it's a motel, but people... it's like a little social housing estate. It's privately run. It's a motel. It's the summer holidays. She's out and about with her friends. The place is called the Magic Castle Motel, but it's peopled by residents, poor, insecure, chaotic lives, very much on the margins of the America that America exports to the rest of the world. But it's cheek by jowl right next to Disney World in Orlando. And what's beautiful about this film is it reminded me, and I did this myself, how children, I didn't live in those circumstances, but through imagination and invention, she has adventures. She curates almost like a fantasy world within this real world, which is how children survive and prosper and can thrive in these environments. However, by the end of the film, the adult world does encroach, and its police and its social workers and its enforcements and its institutions. The final scene where the adult world has encroached on this little girl's fantasy world. And bearing in mind, we have the reality of the Magic Castle, and then we have the constructed fantasy available only to the affluent of the Magic Kingdom in Disney World, is absolutely breathtaking. And a wonderful piece of cinema, and I will leave it there. Stella, you've seen it. You've seen
Oh,
both
Luke,
these
I
films.
hadn't even heard of it until you told me about it, and I don't know why. Seriously, I don't see anywhere near as many films as you, but I would certainly agree with you. It's one of the best films I've seen this century. The ending, I mean, the kids are such phenomenally good actors.
They're not actors; they're all real.
No,
The
that's what I
mother as
mean.
well.
That's what I mean. They're so good at being themselves,
Yeah,
and it's so
extraordinary.
well directed because it lets them just fly. But the truth of the story, and the poverty of the story, and the truth of the poverty cheek by jowl with the absurd and disgusting wealth is so, those helicopters coming in and out. But that ending
Yeah.
is everything that I love in an ending that cannot be spoiled.
And
Now I have something to go towards, which is Luke's favourite films of the 20th century.
my favourite film by an American director.
By an American director.
Of the 21st
how
century.
amazing is that?
And interestingly, the
I'm going to go and watch it now.
You have to.
Immediately.
It's stunning.
I love it, and interestingly, the affluent world, because we're not giving too much away. There's hotels that ring Disney World, and there's golf courses. You never truly get a close up of any of the faces of these people, because they're like shadows for Mooney, the main character. She never gets up close until the agents of that world arrive at the door. Literally, but that's all I will say. Well, I hope those who are listening will be inspired to watch the films or rewatch the films that we've talked about.
I know we're finishing, but I'm just going to say there's a thread here, and there's a thread that goes all the way through these, and it is about youthfulness and the encroaching world. So you've got in Battle of Algiers, you've got that child who's part of the team, right? Who's used all the way through, and he's amazing. And because he's a child adult, he's very much on the edge. He can get in and out in a way that the older men can't. In Gregory's Girl, you've got this, who am I, where am I? We're watching the nurse from outside at the very beginning, and they're trying to make their way into the world, and they only make their way into the world when they lie down on the earth, which I really love. In Desert Hearts, Patricia Charbonneau is the youngest character of the older of the women of the cast, and she's the one who's bringing the youthfulness and the joy. In Five Easy Pieces, you've got his I'm the son and I'm the rebel, but actually he's discarding the adult world that he wants to live in by going off to Alaska, and as you say, Luke, probably losing it because he doesn't want to have to grow up, because he's just proved to himself that growing up is shit. And then you've got Boy, in which you've got both the possibility of the world exemplified by Taika Waititi's father character, who is lying all the way through, but the children still play and the children still have the honesty. And so what we're saying is that revolutions can be made and new things can be created if we would allow the honesty and the openness of youth to infiltrate our agingness. Does that work?
I have nothing to add. You've covered it all. I was just going to mention some more stuff about trains, but I won't bother, because I will now say, Stella, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Thank you also for sharing with us movies that made you want to change the world. Until our next episode, from myself, your host Luke Sorba, and my producer Andrew Payne, I will say goodbye, and this was a Pickard production.